So good evening, everyone, and welcome to our talk tonight. What is dyslexia? So my name is Rebecca Bush, and I would first like to thank the Dyslexia Association of Hong Kong for hosting this free talk tonight. Part of our mission, I must admit, I'm the co-chair of the Dyslexia Association of Hong Kong, and part of our mission is to just get more information out into the community about dyslexia, what it is, what it looks like, and how we can support it. So thank you all for joining us here tonight to learn a little bit more about dyslexia. A few housekeeping tips first, things to think about. First of all, please make sure your cameras do stay off. We will have some question and answers at the end, so if you'd like to turn your camera on, then you're welcome to do so. But during the presentation, please keep your cameras off and please keep yourself muted. If you do have any questions, you're welcome to hold on to them until the end in case I answer them. You're also welcome to put them in the chat box, and we'll have some time at the end for questions. If we really don't get to your question, you can always reach out to us at the Dyslexia Association and we will get back to you as soon as we can. So let's get started on why we're here tonight to talk about what is dyslexia. I'd first like to introduce myself. So I am the co-chair of the Dyslexia Association of Hong Kong, but I've been in education for quite a while. I was a classroom teacher for a while, and along the way, I've studied and learned more to be a reading specialist, a special education teacher, and in terms of dyslexia, I'm an academic language therapist and a dyslexia therapist. So I am licensed and certified in all of those. So long story short, I've spent a lot of time teaching kids how to read, working with teachers to teach them how to better be teachers of reading and writing, and then to also learn a lot more about dyslexia and other language-based learning differences and specific learning differences. If you'd like to learn more about me and what I do, this is my website, leadchanges.com. And this is what we're going to be talking about tonight. So we're going to talk about what dyslexia is, and then give some concrete examples about what that actually means. We're going to talk about some of the common strengths and really those red flags to look for. And then we're going to touch very briefly on what support can look like. That in and of itself is a whole other large discussion, but we're going to touch briefly on that towards the end of the presentation. But really what we're getting at tonight is this. We're going to separate the facts from the myths. There's a lot of misinformation out there. There's a lot of misunderstanding. And so what we want to do tonight is look at what actually is dyslexia. So everything I'm sharing with you tonight, this is not my personal opinion. This is not what I think dyslexia is or what I think it might look like. This is all research and evidence based. So everything I'm sharing with you tonight is based on decades, many, many decades of research and evidence compiled by people who are far more versed in this and have spent a lot more time studying it than I have. So let's get started with the definitions and effects. So what exactly is dyslexia? And then what can it look like? That's what we're going to talk about first. I'd first, though, like to talk about what it's not. There's this, again, there's lots of misunderstanding out there, lots of misconceptions. So to start off with what dyslexia is not. Dyslexia is not anything to do with how smart you are. You can be an incredibly intelligent, very high IQ individual who also has dyslexia. So dyslexia has nothing to do with how smart you are. Dyslexia also has nothing to do with your vision or your eyes. That's something that we thought actually more than 100 years ago. We thought maybe dyslexia had something to do with vision, but it does not. It has nothing to do with how you see. It's how your brain perceives that. So it is not anything to do with how smart you are, and it is not anything to do with your vision. To get into what dyslexia actually is, there are actually several different definitions from around the world, but tonight we're going to be looking at the International Dyslexia Association's definition of what dyslexia is. One, because it's the one I'm most comfortable with, and also because we're a very international city, we're going to look at the international definition. So this is the IDA's definition of dyslexia. And if you have dyslexia, you look at this and you're immediately like, whoa, and your eyes start swimming. So we're actually going to ignore that for a minute. And we're going to break that apart and look at it piece by piece, what it says, and more importantly, what does that actually mean? So this definition, again, is from the International Dyslexia Association. So here is the first sentence of that definition. Dyslexia is a specific learning disability that is neurobiological in origin. The biggest key word there is neurobiological. Well, what does that mean? That means that dyslexia has to do with your brain and how your brain is wired. So this information comes to us from Drs. Shaywitz and Shaywitz from Yale, who, thanks to neuroimaging, have compiled, they're neuroscientists, by the way, they have compiled tons of information of what's actually happening in the brain when we're reading. And that's for people who do not have dyslexia, and for those who do have dyslexia. So what you can see through this information here, if you look at the brain on your left, which is for those who do not have dyslexia, who are typical readers, all the different parts of the brain are firing. So they're activating different parts of our brain when we read. And that's because reading is actually not a naturally occurring human phenomenon. What we've done throughout our development, throughout our evolution over centuries and millennia, is we've essentially wired together lots of different pieces of the brain to allow us to read. But if you look at the brain on the right, for somebody who does have dyslexia, when they're reading or trying to read, there are parts of the brain that are not being activated. And that's because, again, dyslexia is neurobiological in origin. It actually has to do with how the brain is wired and what is getting activated when we're reading. Next part of the definition. It is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition, and by poor spelling and decoding abilities. So this is the piece of the definition that we oftentimes are most comfortable with because it's the one that we can see a lot more clearly. So that accurate or fluent word recognition, they might be reading, but they're making a lot of mistakes. They're reading word by word. And of course, their spelling looks very poor. They might still be over-relying on phonetic spellings or missing letters or chunks of the word as they're trying to write. And of course, then that decoding is they're really just having a hard time reading the words on the page. So what that might look like, this is a reading miscue analysis from a reader with dyslexia. And you can see actually with this reader, she got most of the words correct. So you can see all the little tick marks that those words were being read correctly. But if you look at her rate and her fluency, it's very choppy. So with every word, she really had to kind of stop and think a lot. There also were words where she was swapping them for something else. And sometimes, like with likes and loves, it doesn't necessarily change the meaning of the sentence, but it's not accurate. This reader was not reading all the way through that word, looking at every letter on the page. You could also see where this reader was perhaps still sounding things out, and they might be sounding it out orally, like the he, hello, trying to piece together that word. And then you can see over on the right, the miscue analysis. So what that reader was actually doing, and you can see the trend of what's happening with those errors. So this reader obviously is still struggling to read. And that's one of the things that we look for, that struggle continues on, sometimes even up into adulthood. Reading is still really hard. Here's an example of someone with dyslexia who is writing. You can see that the spelling is not very good, particularly as that sentence continues and that cognitive load and that fatigue the cognitive load increases, and therefore the fatigue also increases. So it's also sometimes common to see that when they're spelling words in isolation, their spelling is actually not that bad, but when they're asked to put words into sentences or paragraphs or stories, that's when we see that spelling really struggle. Sometimes you will also see handwriting affected, but that is not necessarily anything to do with dyslexia. All right, here's the next part of that definition. And this is really where dyslexia comes from. So going back to the wiring of the brain, it's neurobiological in origin. It happens to be that you're probably going to be struggling to read and have poor spelling, but this is really the reason why. So it results from a deficit in the phonological component of language. So that means that the core deficit, as in the thing that they are missing the most in that brain wiring for someone with dyslexia, is the part of the brain that processes the sounds and the chunks of sounds in our language. So let's talk a little bit more about what that actually means. So here is a picture of a cat, right? And when you see that picture of a cat, that word immediately pops into your head, cat. Now you could close your eyes and I could say cat, and then you could break it apart into k, a, t. That has nothing to do with those letters on the screen. I could cover those up completely and you still would be able to hear those sounds. Those are phonemes. Those are the sounds in language. It can also be the chunks of sounds. So it might be a longer word like volcano, but we might swap some of the letters in the middle and say voclano instead. So it's the letters, the actual sounds in it, or the chunks of sound. So that's where we see a lot of these things coming out. So this is what phonological processing actually is. It's your brain's ability to take all of those sounds and chunks of sounds and do something with them. You can understand, you can get the words back out of your mouth to help others understand you. You can process them, you can interpret them, you can recall them. You can do all of these things with those chunks or sounds in our language. We can break this down even further by looking at this little flow chart. So phonological processing is kind of that big umbrella, and you'll see these 4 parts under that. So the verbal short-term memory. So oftentimes even just being able to repeat a sentence back, that might be affected. Phonological awareness, rhyming, for instance, and that's one of those things that we look for even when they're 3.5, 4 years old. Are they struggling to learn to rhyme? Rapid serial naming is your brain's ability to quickly get words out. So if you're talking about colors, I can go red, yellow, green, blue, orange. Someone with dyslexia might struggle to do that at a quick pace. And then of course that articulation speed, particularly when words start getting longer and more complex. They might have to kind of stumble or think a little bit about the sounds or the chunks of sounds in those words. All right, here's the next part of our definition. And this is where, so it says, it is often unexpected in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction. So this is what we call the deficit model. And this, if we go back to before we had neuroimaging and we could actually see what was happening in the brain while reading or trying to read, this is where our diagnoses of dyslexia usually came from. So they had everything they needed to learn to read, but it just wasn't happening for some reason. And prior to neuroimaging, before we had that sort of technology, that's how we came across a diagnosis of dyslexia. So what does this actually mean in relation to other cognitive abilities and the provision of effective classroom instruction? Let's break that down a little bit more. So cognitive abilities. This means, and again, this goes back to what dyslexia is not. It has nothing to do with how smart you are. So essentially, you're smart enough to learn to read. Your IQ, your brain capacity, your functioning, everything is there. You should be able to learn to read, but for some reason you're not. right? And that's where it's in relation to this. It's unexpected, right? You're smart enough, we expect you to learn to read, but it's just not happening for some reason. The other piece of that instruction is effective classroom instruction. Sorry, the other piece of that definition is effective classroom instruction. And that doesn't mean that they're just going to school. It doesn't mean that they're going to a tutor after school. It means that it's effective. They're being taught to read following the science of reading instruction. And that science of reading instruction comes down to these 5 key pieces. And this came from the United States about 30 years ago. They had a huge effort to figure out how best to teach kids to read and write, because they were worried as a country that kids were not learning to read. So the National Reading Panel was formed by neuroscientists, PhDs, psychologists, teachers, all these different experts to systematically go through all of the body of research that was out there and narrow it down to what actually needed to happen to teach kids how to read. And these were the 5 pieces they came up with. So again, we could spend a very long time talking through about what effective instruction actually is, but it's just important to remember that it's not just instruction. It's not just that they're going to school, but that instruction is effective, that it's following the science of teaching reading. So if they have all of those pieces, they seem smart enough, they're being taught in an effective way, but they're still not learning to read, that's where dyslexia can come in. It's also important to remember a bell curve, right? You might not have looked at this for quite a while, perhaps since your economics class or whatever. But those learning to read, as with any section of our population, fall across this bell curve. So there are some kids that can seemingly just pick up a book and learn how to read. And those would be the kids over there on the right portion of that. But for most of our kids, they're going to be in that dark blue and then that little bit lighter blue next to it. They're going to learn to read. They just need that effective instruction. They might need a little bit more time for mastery. So it's really important to keep in mind all of these things when you're thinking about whether it is dyslexia or not, because there are many, many, many different reasons why somebody might be struggling to learn to read. It's not just necessarily dyslexia. So moving past from what dyslexia is and the effect it can have on people and how it's unexpected in relation to who they are as an individual and the kind of instruction they've been getting, we're now moving into these knock-on effects, these secondary consequences. Because if you're struggling to learn to read, even just getting the words off the page is really, really hard. You're using all of your brain energy to do that. You're going to struggle to understand what you're reading, right? So that's why secondary consequences may include problems in reading comprehension. To understand this part of the definition a little bit more, we can look at this from Goff and Tumner and Hoover and Goff, the simple view of reading. I really like this model because it is so simple, right? It's a multiplication equation. And as we know, if you have a 0 anywhere in your multiplication equation, the answer is going to be 0. So if you have dyslexia and you're struggling to decode, yet you're a native speaker, you're very well spoken, you have tons of background knowledge, your vocabulary is really strong, you're still going to struggle to understand what you're reading. So this is really important, that simple view of reading. We could take that simple view of reading and expand it a little bit more using Scarborough's reading row from 2001. So this, I really like this model because it shows you all those little strands that have to weave together to be a skilled reader. And this is a process that takes years. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. But if you look at that bottom piece, the word recognition, that's the part that those with dyslexia are going to struggle with. They're going to have a really hard time with that phonological awareness, the processing of the sounds and chunks of sounds in our language. They're going to have a hard time decoding. And if you have a hard time decoding, you're definitely going to have a hard time encoding with your spelling, because reading and writing go hand in hand. Reading always comes first. You're then also going to have a hard time with that sight recognition. So sight recognition is when, so we as adult readers, we rarely have to stop and sound words out anymore because we've been reading for a long time. We're skilled, expert readers. But I know if I were to pick up a biology textbook, there would be a lot of words that I would have to stop and break apart. So those words are not sight recognized for me. I have to actually think about them. So you want your reading to get to where it's automatic, where it's at sight recognition. For a lot of readers, it can take at least 5, sometimes up to 100 times to accurately read and understand a word before it becomes automatic. And along that spectrum, if you do have dyslexia, particularly if it's a more extreme dyslexia, it may be 100+ times. You might never actually get to that sight recognition. You might have to essentially sound out every word that you come across. All right, moving into the final piece of our definition. This is where that domino effect is going on, right? If I'm struggling to learn to read, it's hard to read, then I'm not going to understand what I'm reading. If I don't understand what I'm reading, I'm not going to want to read. So reduced reading experience, because reading is really hard. I don't want to do it. And that therefore can impede the growth of vocabulary and the growth and acquisition of background knowledge. All right, so let's break this one apart a little bit more. So to do that, we want to look at research from Jeannie Chall, who came up with a stage of reading development. Yeah, please just make sure you mute yourself. Thank you. All right, so from Jeannie Chall's stages of reading development, where you see where that big arrow is, going from stage 2, confirmation and fluency, moving into stage 3, reading for learning the new, that's where this big shift in vocabulary acquisition happens. Before we become fluent readers, we learn most of our words through talking, through experiences, right? Imagine a toddler or a 3-year-old. They're like sponges soaking up all these new words from everyone that's talking around them. Once you become a fluent reader, that shifts. And the majority of your vocabulary acquisition is going to come through reading. And that's because the kinds of words that we use in our daily conversations are different than the kinds of words we see in books. And so again, if you're struggling to get to that stage 3 and you're not reading, you're not going to be learning those new words. And when that happens, we end up with the Matthew effect. So this is a term that you see actually in lots of different areas. It's actually comes from a Bible reference originally, but it was Robert Merton back in the 60s who used this to talk about vocabulary acquisition and how it relates to reading. So it's this downward spiral. Reading is really hard. I don't want to do it. I don't understand what I'm reading. So no, I really don't want to do it. Because I'm not reading, I'm not learning new words. And that just makes it harder to understand what I'm reading. Because maybe I can now decode the words on the page. I can read the word on the page. But if I don't know what that word's about, I'm not going to understand. Or maybe if I have become a pretty good decoder and my vocabulary is okay, but I have very limited background knowledge, then I'm not going to understand. So I mean, as an adult, I love to read murder mysteries and spy novels. I just finished a spy novel about the Cold War. I had to have a lot of background knowledge about that time in history to understand the book. So if you're not reading, if you're not experiencing this wealth of knowledge, of information, you're not going to be acquiring it. And then that Matthew effect just gets harder the older they get, right? That gap widens as time goes on. And that's, again, if we look at what happens in primary schools, when kids are about 8 or 9, there's this huge shift in what they're expected to do. Because prior to 9, which is so usually around grade 3, grade 4, they're still technically learning to read. But moving into grade 3, grade 4, their teachers now expect them to know how to read, and they're no longer learning to read, they are reading to learn. And that's when that gap can increase for those who are struggling to learn to read. All right, so that was a lot of information about what dyslexia is and the challenges that oftentimes come for those who do have dyslexia. It is important to remember too, everyone is totally different. Every individual, every reader is different. Dyslexia is also a spectrum. We can have very mild dyslexia. We can have more severe dyslexia. You can also have an individual with dyslexia may have comorbidity. They may have other issues going on that can compound what's happening with dyslexia. So what we just talked about is the general definition. These are the trends that we see from those with dyslexia, but of course, everyone is a little bit different. All right, so let's talk about some strengths though, because there are some fantastic strengths that come from having a brain that's wired a little bit differently. They oftentimes really think outside the box. They're very creative thinkers. Their brain works in different ways. They see the world in different ways. And that's why so many famous entrepreneurs and actors and actresses and artists have dyslexia, because their brain just works a little bit differently. And that's a beautiful thing. Right? They also can be very visual thinkers and very visually attuned. I've had students that I work with, they'll walk into my classroom or into the office, and I may have moved one little thing, and they immediately notice it. Even all the stuff you see behind me, I rearranged it so it looked nice on camera. Usually there's tons of stuff up there. One of my students came in earlier today, and immediately they're like, what did you do? Why'd you move everything? Where'd it go? They saw that straight away. Because they're very visual, they can be really, really good at identifying patterns. Again, I worked with a student earlier this week. We did this, it comes from Dibbles. This is a rapid automatized naming activity. Assessment is to see how they are with that rapid naming. And really they just have to go through and name the letters. But as soon as I put it down in front of her, she immediately saw the pattern. She saw all of the B's, and then she saw all of the S's and all of the A's, and she was making all of these connections within seconds of seeing this. It was really, really impressive to view. But then when I asked her to do the task as it was designed as an assessment, she really struggled to do that. But she saw this in such a unique and really creative way. Visual and spatial reasoning can also be really, really strong for those with dyslexia. So this is, again, an assessment that you can do where you have to take the blocks and then figure out what it would look like from the top down. Some kids are going to struggle with this, but oftentimes those with dyslexia, they are very visual and they think outside the box. So things like this can be really good for them. All right, let's spend a couple of minutes talking about some red flags. Because there are things that we want to look for. Now, you're not necessarily going to go for an official diagnosis until the child is at least 6, but you can notice things even at 3.5, sometimes even earlier than that, really even at 2. And as soon as you notice something, we can begin intervention. So we're going to go through some of the red flags to look for, and we're going to use, again, these stages of reading development. So what are some things that you should be looking for at each stage? So pre-reading, and again, actually, to go back to this really quickly, one note that we need to keep in mind, and this is happening the world over, and I've seen it even more so here in Hong Kong, is that there's this expectation that readers are going to reach these stages at a younger and younger age. So you'll see ages pop up as we go through these stages. Those are based on research and neurological development. They're not necessarily based on Hong Kong expectations or school expectations. All right, so pre-reading, really even at 6 months. So is when pre-reading starts. You're reading to them, they're starting to notice things around them. But these red flags are going to start to pop up around 2. And the first big cutoff that we're going to look for is that delayed speech development. Are they speaking by the age of 2? And then how quickly are they stringing words together? How quickly are they moving into sentences? Is their wording still kind of hard to understand? Can strangers not quite understand what they're saying? Are they swapping words or letters around when they're talking? By the time they're 3.5, moving into 4, 4.5, really by 4.5, they should be able to rhyme. Are they having trouble learning how to rhyme? Are they not singing those nursery rhymes and understanding them? Difficulty learning letter names. Again, at this pre-reading, we're not doing sounds at all. We really are just looking at names and then letter recognition. And then of course that pencil grip and the letter formation. Moving into K3, so really about 6 is when they really should be starting to learn to read. Are they having trouble pronouncing or remembering new words? So they have been talking about volcanoes at school, and the teacher has said that word volcano multiple times throughout the week, but they come home and they're trying to tell you what they did, and they still can't quite remember that word or can't get the word out quickly enough. Or are they saying tornado instead of volcano? Are they really struggling to learn their letter sound correspondences? So for example, that T says T. Are they having a hard time putting those sounds together and taking them apart? So again, going back to our cat, if I say cat, can they say cat? And this has nothing to do necessarily with reading or writing, but even just listening to those sounds. The handwriting issues, and then some continued reversals. So are they always swapping the B and the D, for example? Now, just a note about reversals. I really like to use this analogy of a chair, because if I were to take this chair and turn it upside down or flip it around, it's still a chair, right? And we can instantly recognize it as a chair. Yet if I take a stick and a ball and move them in 4 different ways, somehow it's a totally different letter with a totally different name and a totally different sound. So it is normal to see this confusion in early readers. It's totally normal. But what we want to look at is it diminishing? Are they making these errors less and less frequently? And also, do they see the difference between them? So if they write a B and they meant to write a D, yet I write a D next to them, can you see the difference between your and mine? Those are the things we want to look for. So is it becoming less frequently? Can they see the difference? And also, by the time that they're getting to the end of grade 1, have they pretty much stopped doing this? So moving into kind of the middle of grade 1 on into grade 2, this is when we're starting to read. So by the middle of grade 1, a reader should be pretty confident reading about 100 words. And that's not necessarily sounding out each word, but reading them. So those words that we see a lot, and, cat, those kinds of words. So at this point, are they still guessing when they read? Are they looking at the picture, over-relying on the picture? Are they reading the first letter, guessing what the word is instead of reading through the word? Are they still reading very slowly? Is it still lots of sounding everything out? And do they not self-correct? So when they read and they say a word that doesn't make any sense in the context of that sentence, do they notice it and fix it, or do they just keep trucking? And this is where you'll start to see a lot of that avoidance. Do they not want to read? And again, are they struggling with their spelling? And again, remember, reading and writing go hand in hand. Reading always comes first. So I would never expect a child to be able to spell independently and accurately the words that they're reading, but you want to see that rate of progress. Moving into confirmation and fluency, so kind of end of grade 2, moving into grade 3, this is when they should be fluent readers. And this is where that shift starts to happen, where they're going from learning to read to reading to learn. So this is why it's not uncommon to see diagnoses for dyslexia pop up in grade 3 and grade 4, because in lower primary, they were probably doing okay. But then all of a sudden things get really hard and they don't have the coping strategies anymore because the expectations have jumped. And so when those expectations jump, that's where oftentimes we can see that these errors are still continuing. They're still really, really struggling to read. And that really means that they're spending way more time and way more energy completing a task than anyone else at that age. It's just a lot harder for them. So that means that it might still be choppy. They're probably starting to really not want to read. They're becoming more anxious. They're avoiding reading. Their comprehension, their understanding of it is really impacted. And their spelling and their writing starts to get really hard because that cognitive load is through the roof when they're trying to write something. We also, with writing, have to keep in mind that writing really is one of the hardest things we can do as human beings. It takes almost every part of our brain kicking in and working together to be able to produce something and put it down on paper. So writing is going to be hard at this age. Their spelling is not going to be perfect, but how hard is it for them and how far behind are they compared to where they should be? Moving into upper primary and then middle school, this is where those expectations really jump, particularly grade 6. The kinds of texts that they're reading are getting a lot harder. So again, they're being asked to read something, think about it, and then do something with that knowledge. So they're not necessarily getting taught through listening or seeing anymore. They're being taught primarily through reading. And again, if you're having a hard time reading, that's going to be really hard for you. And these are some of the things that we'll see. Those mistakes aren't stopping. Now they're really avoiding reading. They really don't want to do it. And really, they're just working so much harder for the same results than their classmates. Moving into high school, university, even as adults, these are some of the signs we can still see. Still kind of thinking for the right word. They don't always understand puns or jokes, particularly puns that involve rhyming. They may just not get it. And reading is still really hard. And hopefully by this point, they would have figured out a different pathway or had the right intervention or come up with coping strategies so they're able to be successful adults, but these issues never really go away. And there's actually all of this information on my website. I have a downloadable PDF that has everything that we just talked about, those red signs. All right, moving into support. So just really, really quickly, we're going to touch on this because, again, this is such a huge topic. We could be talking about this for absolutely forever. But just to give you a few quick little things. And again, this is also on my website as a downloadable PDF. So the first big thing for all of you teachers on our call tonight is quality instruction, right? And that goes back to that definition. That's effective instruction. These are some of the things we want to be looking for effective instruction, whether you have dyslexia or not, that it's systematic, it's following a clear scope and sequence, it's explicit. There is, that sort of whole word, whole language, fun part, but I'm also just going to teach you that, hey, T says t. It's multi-sensory. I'm going to be bringing in all the different senses. It's structured. I'm going to be doing it in a similar way each time. There's a lot of time dedicated to this. The pace is going to be appropriate for those learners. I'm not going to go any faster than I can. So I always like to say we go as fast as we can, but as slow as we need to. You have ongoing assessment to make sure, are they actually mastering these skills? There's also this international organization, IMSLEC, the International Multisensory Structured Language Education Council. They are the international body, which is a sister association with the International Dyslexia Association, who recognizes quality programs around the world. So you can go to their website if you have more information about programs. But again, it comes back to these 5 pieces of reading. This is quality instruction. For parents, one of the big things you can do is work with your school, right? So work with your teachers, be really respectful and open. You all want the best for your kid. But sometimes teachers may not necessarily know how to approach this issue or what to look for or what to expect. And that's where you can ask those really specific questions. What program are you using? Is it sequential? Is it student-led or teacher-led? How much time, how many minutes every day are you devoting to this? Are you reading with them? Are they reading? What phonics program are you using? There are really specific questions you can ask. This is the biggest thing that I think we can all walk away with as well. Time is really important. And we can look at that in several pieces. So the first one, and this is for parents and teachers, don't wait until they fail to get help. I can't tell you how many parents I have talked to that said, yeah, even when they were about 3 years old, I kind of saw that there was something a little different, but I didn't think it was such a big deal and school didn't say anything. And then here we are, 6, 7, 10 years later, and they're so far behind that the amount of information we need to catch up on has just dramatically increased. The other big way that time is really important is cognitive windows. That goes to the neuroplasticity of our brain. The human brain is an incredible, fascinating thing. When we're born, of course, for neurotypical brains, I should say, when we're born, you have the ability to learn just about anything. But what happens over time is your brain says, okay, well, that isn't important, and that neuroplasticity starts to harden. It's a lot harder to learn things, right? Learning languages is a perfect example. If you learn a language at 2, or you learn a language at 20, it's like night and day. So when we talk about dyslexia and language-based learning differences, there is a very clear window where we can essentially rewire the brain through effective intervention. But that window closes around the age of 6 or 7. So again, early intervention, early detection is really, really important. Another thing I would say is practice makes permanent. Practice does not make perfect. So just because you've been practicing and practicing and practicing, that doesn't mean they're going to get it. So you want to make sure that you're teaching and practicing in a way that works for that child. And I love this quote from Priscilla Vale. So again, this goes back to having kids move into that automatic sight recognition. It could be 5, it could be 100, it could be 150 times that you need to accurately read and understand a word before it becomes a sight recognition word. So time, right? So for teachers, these are some of the things you can think about for time. Structure your ELA blocks. Make sure you have that balanced literacy approach. Include explicit teaching. Teach them how to read. Teach them how to spell. Embed literacy into every aspect of the program as well, particularly if you're talking about bilingual schools. There's so much stuff you need to be doing. And really for first grade, ideally you would have 200 minutes a day just for your ELA block. But oftentimes that's just not possible, right? But so we can embed it in other ways throughout your day and week. For parents, these are some of the things you can do. One of the big things is to read with your family, read with your kids. And there's so much that they can be learning through reading with you, even if they're not reading themselves. You can also bring reading into all the different things you're doing. You can read the menu together or talk about things. As you're going around, they can read signs. Even reading the stop sign, that's a form of reading. Some other things you can do to help at home. One of the things for the parents out there, one of the biggest things for you to remember, though, is for you to cherish and hold on to that child-parent relationship. You're not the teacher, you're not the tutor, and you want to be their advocate, be their cheerleader, and be there to support them emotionally, because it's going to be, or very well can be, hard and stressful and anxious. They're going to need your help. We can also help with comprehension, right? So reading, writing, speaking, and listening are all connected, and you could be working on reading skills without actually reading. So you can do all of these things, ask questions, you can visualize, look for cues, clues, all of these things just through talking. You don't necessarily have to be reading. Oral language, again, is really, really important, because remember, if they're not reading, they're not learning new words. So we've got to be doubly sure that we're teaching them new words so that that downward spiral of the Matthew effect does not happen. Because yeah, they're all connected, right? Another really great quote from Priscilla Vale, and this is for those early readers, the beginning readers, but same for readers with dyslexia. They're going to learn to read by being taught to read, first of all, but also because they have the language to then understand what they are reading. So you can play with language, right? The phonological awareness skills, the rhyming, you can have a lot of fun with it. This is the umbrella of all the different phonological awareness skills that are out there. And this is a great website for parents and for teachers as kind of a starting point to learn a little bit more about phonological awareness and some of the activities that you can do to support that. Again, all of this is on my website as a downloadable PDF. Here are some other reliable websites. There's tons of information out on the internet. It's not always reliable, but these are some ones that you can rely on. So the first two are, of course, Hong Kong-based resources. So ourselves, the Dyslexia Association. There's also Focus, which is another nonprofit focused on supporting individuals with specific learning differences. And then these three websites at the bottom, the International Dyslexia Association, understood.org, and Reading Rockets are really great resources for more evidence and research-based information on dyslexia, what it is, and how you can support.